Hi, Josh. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Excellent. Thank you very much for asking. I am going to go ahead and get this party started.
Okay.
Well, and for everyone out there who is just joining us for the first time today, welcome, welcome. And for all of you who have been with us all day, welcome back. This is our final presentation of the day, and it's going to be a really good one. I've been looking forward to this one all day. As all of you know that have sat through this throughout today and that have been in these with us in the past, first of all, my name is Billy. Sorry, I jumped in, got really excited. I'm with Accelerant Research, and I'm going to be hosting the call. But as you all know, kind of like the general ground rules of today is that we are at the mercy of tech. We all know that by now. We've all been living in the Zoomosphere. Just please be respectful of each other and the comments and the presenters. And then also we're going to have an opportunity to ask Josh questions throughout the process, but we're also going to have an opportunity after the presentations to be able to continue the dialogue and to network and engage and interact and so forth, okay? And so I get to introduce Josh DeFriez. Am I saying that right, Josh?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. And he's going to be presenting a topic that we are all very close to. He's going to be talking from the perspective of Walgreens about vaccine rollout. So knowing when to pivot, design research, and the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. So this should be fascinating for all of us. Josh is a senior design researcher over at Walgreens. So Josh, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. So if you want to go ahead and start sharing. Throughout, if you want to go ahead and just put questions in the chat box, and I'll be kind of monitoring that, and I'll be sending those over your way. Okay, Josh?
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing, and there you go.
There we go.
You can start.
Okay, so first off, you might notice that I changed the title of this presentation from knowing when to pivot to research and anxiety. It's still the same topic, but I think this one is actually a little bit more indicative of the themes that I want to talk about. As I'm sure everyone can imagine, the vaccine rollout has been chaotic and there have been a lot of learnings and a lot of problems that have come up along the way that have required us to, make changes on the fly. And so I have learned a lot in the past 6 months about adjusting to change. And I'd like to share some of those insights that I've learned with all of you. So I guess before jumping into it, I'll just introduce myself a little bit more. I grew up in rural Utah and then moved to Chicago to do a master's degree where I actually studied Chinese history. I've been kind of academically promiscuous. I've always switched between subjects. So interdisciplinary thinking is very important to me. And after graduating, I worked in marketing research for a couple of years and then switched over to design research at Walgreens. And one more thing, I guess before I get into it, I just want to say thank you to Bill McDowell for inviting me to participate in the session. And I also want to give a big thanks to the design research team at Walgreens. They've given me constant support and feedback throughout the ups and downs and pivots of conducting design research during the COVID vaccine rollout. And nothing makes a bigger difference, as I'm sure we all know, than working with thoughtful, earnest, caring colleagues. So with that, let's get into it. Anyone who has worked in applied research has had the experience of finishing a project only to wish at some point that they had done something slightly different or gone in a different direction. In retrospect, we often talk about having seen red flags along the way. And then after we do that reflective thinking, then later on in the future, we're able to notice red flags when they pop up the first time. but it's more difficult to notice red flags along the way, especially when you're charting new territory. So today I'm going to share the story of the last 6 months of conducting research to support the vaccine rollout. And I hope that it's going to serve as a helpful case study for learning to identify and respond to new red flags as you experience them, rather than waiting to reflect on them in retrospect. But before we get into that, I want to set the stage a little bit by introducing you to Dr. Sherry Turkle, a social scientist at MIT who has really deeply influenced the way that I think. Dr. Turkle is a professor of social studies of science at MIT. She joined the faculty there at the dawn of the computational revolution, and she was drawn to studying the impact that computers have on how people describe their own minds and how they relate to one another. I really admire Dr. Turkle's ongoing insistence of the importance of emotional self-awareness as a really important variable in qualitative methodologies. As part of her training, she decided to undergo years of therapy herself and became a licensed clinical psychologist so that she could learn to unpack the relationship that our inner lives have with the social worlds that we inhabit. And she's argued persuasively that one's own emotional reactions to their research must be carefully unpacked and incorporated into the research process itself. And for anyone interested in her work, I highly recommend her recently published memoir, The Empathy Diaries, which is a really great showcase of the relationship between working in qualitative research and developing self-understanding. So following in Dr. Turkle's footsteps, I really want to use this time to emphasize how important it is that we honestly confront what we're seeing inside of ourselves when we're developing research insights. So without any further ado, let's jump into the COVID story.
Josh, if you are,
Yes.
I don't know if you have a presentation. You're a great storyteller. Do you have
Is there,
something
is
nice
it
to
not
see?
sharing?
No, and you were such a great storyteller that I didn't know if you were just gonna.
Oh, thank you. No, I have clicked share screen and oh, you know what? I didn't click the share button though, but my
It's
screen was
okay.
highlighted in blue. So you all missed just
It's okay. We didn't need visual
beautiful
aids. You painted a beautiful picture.
slides. Thank you. No, I was clicking through slides. I'll show you real quick. That's what Dr.
Oh,
Turkle looks like. Isn't she great? And then I had these red flags and whatever. We'll move on. Thank you for letting me know. So I'd like everyone to pause for a moment and think back to how you were feeling in October of last year. It's almost kind of hard to think back that far because so much has happened in the world since then. But it was a really messy time, as I'm sure everyone can recall. The election had everyone on their toes. Rising coronavirus cases sent many of us back into social isolation. And there was a general mood of anxiety around the question of how the COVID-19 pandemic would change the global economic system. Additionally, there was increasing discussion in October of last year about the number of vaccine candidates that were in trial at the time. And around mid-October at Walgreens, our product and business stakeholders had been strategizing for a while about how to enable online scheduling for the eventual vaccine rollout. One of our pharmacy product managers approached the design research team and requested that we help prepare by conducting foundational research on the current end-to-end immunizations experience, because Walgreens, as you may or may not know, offers flu shots every year and, also a variety of other vaccines. So we wanted to dig into that experience, uncover what pain points patients were currently having, and then also include a generative component to help formulate a roadmap for the ideal immunizations experience at Walgreens that would integrate COVID-19 appointments with the pre-existing tools for other immunizations. Now, keep in mind that as we were planning this research in late October and early November, most people expected a vaccine to be approved in early 2021. So we were intending to deliver these results by December, so that they could be there in time, for the vaccine rollout. And then based on that assumption, we planned a four-phased approach that started with an audit of existing research and combined with an analysis of customer satisfaction and data analytics. And then after that, holding stakeholder interviews, and then workshops with pharmacists and pharmacy techs to uncover what concerns they have and what ideas they had for the vaccine rollout in general and for integrating these various tools. And then the fourth phase was going to be patient interviews. And in the middle of the winter, it's peak flu shot season. So we were like, perfect, we can get patients to go and get a flu shot at Walgreens and then come into the interview. It's going to be lovely. So, and we finished that first phase pretty quickly and delivered it in early November, and then transitioned on to the second phase of stakeholder interviews. And that is when things started to change. In early November, the media started reporting that vaccine approvals were on the horizon, perhaps as early as late November. And our stakeholder interviews began just as the entire organization began to mobilize in preparation for the impending rollout that was now slated to happen earlier than many had expected. So during these stakeholder interviews, we started out with just that core product team that had approached us. And then they referred us to some others who were also very important on the business side or the operations side. And as we spoke to more stakeholders, they referred us to more and more and more stakeholders, because it turns out that in order to execute a vaccine rollout nationwide, you need a lot of collaboration between a lot of different people. And so as we realized the sheer number of decision makers here, it became clear that the scope of research was really beyond the needs of just those initial few stakeholders that had approached us. And in fact, each of these additional stakeholders were also really needing research insights to make their decisions, but all of them had slightly different questions or were coming at it from different angles. And so, to be quite honest, at this point, I started getting really anxious. It was difficult just to fit these interviews in and to schedule them because everyone was so busy. And beyond just the scheduling, there's the question of how will we account for the diversity of interests in this research? How can we keep all of these different people who are so busy involved? How will we make sure the right people receive the right insights at the right time? It became clear that this was going to be a very complex endeavor. And given the importance of the project, I decided that I needed to be stoic about it and just grin and bear it. Unfortunately, though, my anxieties only grew. Each progressive conversation with stakeholders revealed new layers of information, constant updates that the stakeholders we'd spoken to a day or two ago hadn't even known yet. And as the updates filtered through the organization, priorities shifted at an alarming pace. It felt like a whirlwind. And to be clear, it still feels like a whirlwind. And each new wind of information or updates would cause someone to pivot and switch into a new direction with their workflow. As their priorities shifted, our list of research questions ballooned, really beyond the scope of just this 1 week of interviews that we had planned. So given all those changes, we pivoted our plan for the workshops with pharmacists and pharmacy technicians. instead of focusing on the existing immunizations experience, we focused a lot more on their concerns about the vaccine rollout and the ideas that they had. And so here are some of the artifacts from those workshop sessions. We delivered the report on those workshops in early December, and we were honestly really disappointed with the lack of traction that it gained with our stakeholders. So many of their priorities had already shifted so many times since we planned the workshops that by the time we delivered the results, they were already on to something new. So in December, we decided to postpone the patient interviews until late January to allow some more time for alignment. But when January rolled around, our stakeholders were so busy with urgent directives that there was rarely time to meet as a group. And the lack of alignment on priorities led us to push the research back even further to the first week of February. In the last weeks of January, as I was reviewing all the research questions we'd collected, the stimulus we'd put together, and tried shaping these into a discussion guide, I couldn't just grin and bear it anymore. I started feeling really down about the project. I knew that by the time we delivered the results, priorities would have shifted again. And we weren't certain that the results we had would even be impactful by the time they were delivered. As the vaccine rollout commenced in January, my UX and product colleagues were working on such specific elements of the scheduling flow that the holistic end-to-end insights we had planned to gather really wouldn't meet their urgent demands. And additionally, the generative component wouldn't be possible because no one had time to come up with ideas to test in the research. And so my anxieties about the constraints of the research plan really left me feeling powerless to provide my colleagues the kind of information that they really needed for the critical decisions they were making. For a while, I found myself avoiding working on the discussion guide just to push away these feelings. But I remembered Sherry Turkle and the importance of analyzing your own emotions when conducting the research. So I turned inward and I asked myself, how am I really feeling? And then, as happens with me from time to time, there popped into my head a pseudo-profound piece of guidance from my childhood hero, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class. At the end of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Dumbledore says to Harry, happiness can be found even in the darkest times, if only one remembers to turn on the light. Now, let me be real, I actually really hate this quote a lot. Even when I first read it at the age of 14, I thought, wow, what a dumb thing to say. There's never any simple switch for the darkness of anxiety and powerlessness. And so for years now, whenever I get to that space of feeling very anxious or just feeling dark and down, this quote pops into my mind in kind of a sardonic tone, like it's coming back and mocking me with its simplistic worldview, its empty gestures towards hope. So here I was, the week before the interviews were supposed to start, with a whole bunch of anxieties and one really dumb wizard quote. And at that point, I stepped back and asked myself, okay, what's really going down here? What are the reasons that I'm feeling anxious? And moreover, is Albus Percival wrong here? Or does he have a point? Should I, question my lifelong hatred of this quote? And so I wondered, are there actually light switches here somewhere that I'm just missing? Right around that time, I also read a really beautiful article by the philosopher Samir Chopra about the importance of anxiety. Pulling from Kierkegaard's classic work, The Concept of Anxiety, Chopra argues that our anxieties represent our unease about something that has been unrealized. So if we unpack our anxieties, we discover that they only exist because there's something we value that isn't being realized. According to Kierkegaard, our anxieties can become a sort of school for self-development by illuminating what we value. Thinking of anxieties as the flip side of our values can help us reframe negative situations in positive, pragmatic terms, and can open our eyes to solutions we hadn't even thought of yet. When I pondered these anxieties after reading that article, I discovered to my chagrin that Dumbledore was right. There was a light switch after all. I could switch on the light by using my anxieties to identify my underlying values and then reframe the problems in positive terms that are coming from what I value rather than what I'm afraid of. So as I sat down to unpack it and ask myself, why do I feel anxious? Well, I feel anxious because there are too many cooks in the kitchen. There are so many people involved that it is difficult to get all of them the insights that they need. It's difficult to get buy-in for participation for the research. And moreover, it's coming at a time when we desperately need research. Second, my second anxiety is the pace at which everything was shifting. It was just so hard to keep track of all the changes. And then the third anxiety was that there was no time to meet with anyone. So even if I, wanted to align with people, I really wasn't able to. And I did not do these animations correctly. Please forgive me. And here's the seams. Okay, so then I started wondering, okay, what values does this reveal about me? And I thought about it. Well, the number of stakeholders is causing me anxiety because I value stakeholder involvement. The pivoting and the busyness was causing me anxiety because I value timeliness for research results. I'm going to have to pause here and say that unfortunately, the vaccine rollout is still a whirlwind, and there's been just tons of work to do on it. And so I unfortunately was not able to finish all of the slides as I had intended to. I hope that everyone will forgive me, but I will continue with just a voiceover from here with a nice little calendar matched to how many vaccines have been delivered at each given time. So when I thought about stakeholder involvement, I realized that the problem was that our process for research at Walgreens tended to be creating a new space and then asking stakeholders to come there and join it. A kickoff call, a research meeting, things that are set up by us that then they have to come do. And so given the constraint that there were this many stakeholders involved, if I value stakeholder involvement, I realized I need to go to where they're at. Instead of inviting them into new meetings on top of everything else, I need to start joining the meetings they're already in, where all of these pivots and changes and updates are happening. And then the second thing is I needed a forum to be able to communicate to any and all stakeholders who were interested in the research. So we created a Microsoft Teams channel specifically for design research and used that really on a voluntary basis, just giving people updates, asking questions in there, and then people could participate as they would. And meanwhile, I started to embed myself more in the ongoing meetings that our stakeholders were having. Now, the second piece was timeliness. We had originally planned to have 20 interviews in 1 week. And if you are assessing the end-to-end experience of immunizations at Walgreens, I think that's a great plan. But if you're trying to provide insights for an ongoing rollout of a vaccine that has never happened before, then it turns out that 1 week of 20 interviews just is not timely. The planning it takes to do it takes so much time that by the time you deliver the results are already too old. And so instead of having 20 interviews in 1 week, we reached out to the recruiters and asked them to reschedule those 20 interviews across 4 weeks. And so we had 5 to 6 interviews set up each week for 4 weeks. And then instead of planning what we were going to do in each interview, in each week ahead of time, we held a weekly meeting to align on what we gathered were the most important things based on the other meetings that I had now become embedded in. And so in order to do this, we really had to create a well-oiled machine. Every single hour of every day was planned out to the T. We had interviews on Monday and Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, we had a planning meeting for the next day, and Thursday was spent half of it in analysis of the findings on Monday and Tuesday, and usually the other half of it creating a survey, because we also needed a lot of quantitative insights. And so and then delivering the results on Friday. And so most weeks there were 6 interviews, 2 to 3 surveys, and then a debrief on that Friday. And it was very difficult, as I'm sure you can imagine. I think that the thing that got me through it was just knowing how important the vaccine rollout was and feeling that sense of meaning. But I found that even though my workload doubled, I was so much more emotionally stable and confident and invested in the work than I had been before, because I had gone through that process of really, examining how the situation made me feel and how the research problems made me feel, and then really digging deep to question what underlying values were causing those feelings to emerge. Now, in the process of these 4 weeks of research, we covered all sorts of different topics, from the vaccine scheduler tool to the tool that people use to set up appointments for COVID testing, to patient expectations about in-store interactions, et cetera, et cetera. And by the end of it, we were able to gather a much more holistic perspective than we ever could have just in doing 1 week of research. And since then, things have continued, at not exactly that pace, but sometimes very close to it. And we've applied the same approach with doing research among our pharmacy technicians and pharmacists to identify pain points that they're experiencing. And we've done a lot of work to align with stakeholders on how to implement these findings as fast as possible. And something else that I have learned in that process, and I'm kind of going off script here. I've been off script for a while, if I'm honest. But I think that something really important that I've learned in that process is that you can't always just follow the regular way of doing things, and that when you break away from the regular way of doing things, people will often surprise you with how supportive they are. When I went to my manager and said, I don't think that this 1 week of research is a good idea. I think we should do something else. I was nervous because my proposal felt really big, like a huge shift. And it was literally 4 days before the research was supposed to start. And I was just blown away by how supportive she was and how supportive the entire organization was. And so another, I think, key takeaway for me from this whole experience is that developing trusting relationships with your colleagues is a really critical component to managing your own well-being in the midst of a hurricane. I guess I will stop there and open it up for any questions.
Okay, Josh, I'm going to get the party started here with questions, because what you've shared with us is absolutely fascinating. To have this inside look at the Walgreens apparatus as all of this was going on, and for you to share so intimately how it affected you. Thank you. That is very refreshing. And with that said, one of the questions that I have is part of the anxiety that you felt to, I understand like all the stakeholders and everything changing and the world is just, but the gravity of what you were working on, how did that play into it? And how did that change the dynamic amongst, everyone that you touched?
I think that, in this talk, I've really framed it as my anxieties.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually inaccurate. Anxiety is a social phenomenon. It spreads through people. And so a lot of the process was also, learning to not take on other people's anxieties. The gravity of it all has honestly been really difficult. The sorts of interviews that I've had with patients and also with team members on the ground have been the most emotionally taxing interview experiences of my career. And something that I've taken away from that is that there's a critical difference between empathy and compassion, and that sometimes in order to protect ourselves, we should not exercise empathy. Empathy, is the attempt to simulate in your own head what the other person is going through, to feel the feelings they're going through. And when you're encountering so many people with so many feelings, you just can't hold that all. And so it's been really important for me to sometimes let go of that emotional connection, be a little bit more analytical, and focus instead on just trying to exercise and feel compassion for the people I'm interacting with instead of taking their emotions on.
Wow. And the gravity of the work that you were doing too, part of it is, like you said, just being able to have these really deep conversations with people and to kind of understand their pain, but not make it, overwhelm you. But then there's also the analysis part. Qualitative is already difficult because it's not, you're not looking at numbers, right? You're looking at people's thoughts and you're translating those thoughts and so forth. So how did that play into it? Because again, the work that you're doing was very critical in developing this roadmap for your team.
Mm-hmm.
And the translation of the information.
Definitely. So in terms of the analysis, well, so the first thing is that when we switched to this more guerrilla research approach, we knew that there was a trade-off. That when you're doing this volume of research each week, there just does not exist enough time in the day to do as rigorous an analysis as would be ideal. Having said that, I think that the critical thing in translating the qualitative findings into actionable recommendations was to be able to clearly articulate the reasons why what a couple people said in interviews can translate into a scalable problem. So one thing that I will often talk about with stakeholders when they say, okay, yeah, this only came up in like 2 or 3 interviews, out of like the 6, then often the way I think about it is, well, statistically speaking, how likely is it that any given 2 or 3 people will encounter the exact same problem? And the answer is that it's actually statistically very unlikely. And so as soon as you have a couple people encountering the same problem, and when you're moving at such high speeds with that low number of interviews each week, then that's the basis you have on which to judge. And statistically speaking, it is more probable that if something came up with 2 or 3 people, it's more likely than if it came up with 1. Or on the flip side, there were often times when we couldn't get a good enough demographic mix as we would like. And so maybe one week we were only talking to one senior who struggles with technology. And so, the issues that came up with them, we would have to take more seriously, even though it was only a single person. And I think that a lot of that interpretation and like how to interpret the findings from like a single interview with a senior about this really just comes down to having a few years of experience working with these demographics on these issues. That over time, if you remain in the same subject area, you start to see patterns and you start to intuit what is and is not idiosyncratic in what people are telling you. And I think it's really important as qualitative researchers that we listen to our intuition and that we listen to it with a critical lens. Because I do think that intuition and emotion play critical roles in cognition, and that's part of how we think and how we process things. So I think it's important to like allow yourself to take that into account as one piece of data. I hope that answered the question. I feel like I'm rambling.
It does. No, you're not. It's fascinating. And you also spoke to the importance of having a team around you that's established trust. So I'm going to assume too that in the scenarios that you talk to, again, if you don't have quantitative data to support your analysis and the translation of what you've heard, that level of, and you're using your intuition and the experience you've gained over time, that level of trust has to be there with your teams, so that when you do say that, they're like, I trust Josh that this is a fair analysis of the situation.
And tactically speaking, because I think that maybe a more pragmatic answer to your question would be, I did not have time to review any of the recordings. No one else had bandwidth to take notes for me. Usually, every now and again they did. And so the way that I did the analysis was, I really deeply believe in qualitative research. You should be with people, not with paper. I don't know if anyone's heard that one before, but I believe it's really important to devote all of your attention to the conversation. And so I would do that, and then immediately after the conversation, just do a really big brain dump. And then as I started seeing trends between people, I would start, tracking like what came up where, but it was really just after the conversation for the most part. And luckily, in subsequent rounds of research, we've had a lot more availability for note taking. And so we've been able to, build out, I like to use OneNote. So I'll build out a notebook with, a single page for each interview, and then put a template in there for the note takers. And so when we have the luxury of taking notes or have enough time to like review recordings and take notes on them, then that's usually my go-to, is putting things in OneNote and then creating a synthesis page and, dragging quotes from individual pages there and doing what we all do, the cluster analysis sort of stuff.
So is there any questions? I have more, but are there any questions from any of our members who are joining us? They're just fascinated. They're in awe of your process. I guess one of the things I thought was very interesting too, Josh, is when you took us through that in a very planful way. You had this all constructed. You had the whole framework laid out, and at some point you realized that you had a problem, and in engaging the stakeholders, because their world was spinning too, and there were so many of them. And then at that point, you reframed the problem, right? And you went from how do we get them to interact with us to how do we find a way to interact with them? Like, I think that was fascinating. Is that something that you've encountered at Walgreens before, or was that kind of a unique situation here?
That was kind of a unique situation here. I think prior to the pandemic, we had a fairly standard operating model for research. So our team, it kind of works as an internal consultancy. We have a team of researchers. We often switch around between subjects and projects, and it's pretty templated. You have your kickoff call where you align on the research questions and review the research proposal. And then you meet again later to review all the screening criteria and then the discussion guide. And then you do the research and then have a formal report, and then you move on to the next project. And that's kind of just been the way of operating that we have found to be most successful in this organization. And then the context change when the rollout happened, it totally shifted the environment. And when you're in a new environment, you have to adapt and find new ways to do things.
What have you, I'm curious then, because you've had to change a lot about the way that you operate. What will you take with you? What will you keep with you and apply moving forward, even though it won't be like this? This is like kind of a once in a lifetime type of problem that you had to tackle. But are there things that you learned that you're like, we should implement those moving forward in the way we work?
I have to take a second because this isn't over.
I know,
I gave you chapter 1.
I know.
And so it's I don't know that I've had the time to sit back yet and think about in the long term, how does this, change what we'll do? I think that the I feel like I have a lot more thoughts on what we won't do in the future, which is really, really good. Yeah. But I think that being more embedded in those conversations between business stakeholders and product stakeholders is really important. And I'm really happy to have experienced that now, because prior to working at Walgreens, I was at a consultancy. And so, you're also external there, not really embedded in the internal meetings usually. And working at Walgreens felt pretty similar to that for, until the pandemic. And then since then, I've been a lot more integrated into other meetings. And I think that's something important that I'll continue.
Yeah.
And then I think a second really, really big takeaway that's now occurring to me is the importance of design research for strategy. I think that people often tend to think of user research as being tactical, very in the weeds. And I've found sometimes that the sort of pushback you get from some leadership about usability problems is, well, that's just a small detail. It's just a small detail. We have bigger fish to fry. But unfortunately, we live in a world composed of small details.
Yeah.
Everything is just like the composition of many, many details. And I think that very, very small tactical decisions can have huge strategic impacts. And I also think that qualitative researchers in general, but then especially user and like design researchers, are so close to the people actually using the end product that we just develop a, a more acute sensibility for how people tend to react to things in general. And I think that there is a large bias among people who have a business background or other backgrounds for quantitative measures. And I absolutely love quantitative measures, don't get me wrong, but and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but I always come back to the idea that the map is not the territory. You know, quantitative measures kind of show you the map, but the map of a place will never tell you like how the flowers smell there, you know, or, you know, any other little details that actually inform people's behavior. I've forgotten what the question was at this point. Forgive me.
It's okay. So I guess the other side to this coin is you were sharing like how it will potentially impact, you know, Walgreens moving forward in regards to research and design research. But what about you personally? I mean, you shared with us some pretty personal and, you know, feelings that you had around anxiety and going through this whole process. How will this change you? What you've gone through?
Oh, I think that one thing that already has changed in me, and that's evidenced by the kind of presentation I gave, is that I just feel like I don't have time to put on a professional mask all the time anymore. I'm just like, sorry, this is what you've got. This is what you're dealing with. And I think it's really, I think that I believe more than ever in the importance of being honest with people and the importance of treating everyone you interact with as a full, complex human being. And being willing to be vulnerable usually opens other people up to also be vulnerable and can really help to build trust. And so I think that's been one big takeaway of mine.
Oh, that's amazing.
Personally.
That's amazing that, you know, just that ability to connect with, I mean, it's so important to qualitative research, right? That you have to have that ability to very quickly connect with somebody so that they will, you know, they'll open up to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that, you know, like you said, with the patients that you had to talk to and the stakeholders and so forth, that wasn't an easy place to go with them. But thank you so much for being the person that could go there with them.
Yeah. I don't know. Are we at what's time at?
We have 10 more minutes. So
10 more minutes.
if there's
Okay,
anything else you'd like to share with us?
Oh, I just had something pop into my head related to what you said that I really wanted to share, which was that
Please.
I watched a beautiful documentary the other day about friendships between animals of different species on YouTube. Highly recommended. But one thing I took away from it that was really interesting is that in play between animals of all species, but then also interspecies, you have this flip between aggressive behavior and vulnerable behavior. That and the aggressive behavior helps animals to learn because it turns on their anxiety, which helps them remember more. But then the vulnerable behavior of, you know, like a dog laying down and showing its belly or something like that is an indication that like, I'm friends with you, you know, we can trust each other. And so I think that it's like something so similar, like something so simple that we see all over the animal kingdom, you know, that we really need to reflect on in our own professional relationships as well. That the way that you build rapport with people is sometimes through showing your soft side or showing your weak side. That's not something that should be hidden.
Oh, I wonder. That's a wonderful way to end it. I am a big reader of Brene Brown and all of the work that she does around empathy and vulnerability and so forth, and how she's applied that to her own research practice, and then just helping people. I think that's a beautiful story that you shared with us. Thank you so much for everything you've done at Walgreens. It's amazing work, and you know, such valuable work that you've done. So thank you. I know it cannot have been easy, and I know that you're, like you said, the road is still ahead of you, that we are not out of this yet. So you have a lot of work to do. So thank you.
I'm sure I will uncover so many more values.
You
so
will.
Many more values will be uncovered.
You will learn so much about yourself, but
Exactly.
you know, after you've gone through this process. And I also want to thank everyone else who's attended today's presentations. We have learned so much. We are so blessed in our industry to have so many smart people who are willing to share with each other. And so that is wonderful. Please, we will be sending out presentations. These will all be made available to everybody. So you can always reach out to presenters and to us if you want more information. Also, keep a lookout in your inbox. There'll be more details to come for next month's events. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day too.
You too.
Bye.